Charter Local Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance in the Inland Empire, joined today by Elliott Duchon. He is the superintendent at Jurupa Unified School District, which is outside of the city of Riverside, covering almost all of Jurupa Valley as well as portions of the city of Eastvale.
Correct.
And I want to talk to you about objective measurements.
Okay.
Objective measurements it can cause a lot of consternation, a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, and we recently had our first objective measurements released under the new Common Core standards, and it's hard to deny they just weren't that good. In English and math, those meeting standards were, in English, I guess 44% met standards. In math, I guess 33% met standards.
So you take a test like the CASP,
Right.
which is based on a national model, normed nationally, but where the standard cut points are set arbitrarily by a group of experts. And then you give that test for the first time, and we expected, first of all, that the scores would be relatively low. For one, because it's a difficult test, and it tests in a different way than students are used to be testing. So yes, it's objective in the end in that it produces a number, but it's kind of like if you took a picture with the camera and spun the camera in the different modes, whether you were going to do a soft focus, a hard focus, and then took the picture and said, this is the child.
But here is one objective measurement that I think is troubling, regardless of the fact that this was the first time we saw the results. I want to ignore issues of ethnicity and race, and I want to focus exclusively on economic disadvantage. Because when you look at economic disadvantage, the English results, meeting standards, 31%. Economic disadvantage in math, meeting standards, 21%. There's something about poverty that seems to really impact these scores. Am I reading it correctly?
You are absolutely correct. And I think most people would have predicted that, that any standard measurement of test in any state is going to reflect the socio-demographics and the poverty, forget race.
Why?
So there's a lot of research on poverty and neuroanatomical development.
Truly.
And I'll just cite one. Massachusetts, a researcher by the name of John Gabrielli, looked at Massachusetts tests of achievement, socioeconomic status, and was the third one, IQ. They correlated straight across the board. And so when that's predictable, you have to say that there is an opportunity gap between children who grew up in poverty and the rest of us. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Everything ranging from what we call adverse childhood experiences that happen very young and impact brain development.
Are you talking about actual events or nutrition?
Everything. Stressors in early childhood may come from an early childhood parental breakup. It may come from living in neighborhoods that are harder to live in. It may come from pollutants. It may come from parent education, a number of things. So the bad news is that creates an opportunity gap, and that continues through life where kids from higher middle class or higher class families have more what one researcher calls airbags to help them out. You know, they get a bout with drinking and their parents going to take them to the best psychologist in town. Those resources are not available to all kids.
So let's talk about Jurupa Unified, which I think it's fair to say is a middle class to lower middle class community. Is that fair?
I think it would be. We have 80% free and reduced lunch.
So more
So we
lower.
call ourselves relatively low SES.
And so what is that? What does that fact tell you about your students?
So it tells me that in order to really address that opportunity gap, for a student from Jurupa to have the same chance to go to a Cal State or as a UC, we have to do some things in the school system that are going to help that student in a little bit different way, because the good news is those impacts of poverty can be overcome.
How?
And so they can be overcome, first of all, with high quality early childhood education. They can become with parenting classes, working with parents to talk to their kids, play with their kids, interact in a different way than maybe they're normally used to interacting with their kids. can be overcome by providing stimulating programs with high academic rigor, coupled with support for the student that says, when a student says, I'm not good at math, to say to the student, wait a second, let me show you that you can solve this math project. It helps, I mean, other things like that we're doing is we're developing a stringed instrument program in the district.
I've heard actually that there's a direct correlation between musicality and math acumen.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I can't prove it to you, but so we have our 4th, 5th, and 6th graders at 4 of our poorer schools are taking violin lessons, and next year we're going to turn one of the schools into a magnet school as a music academy, because I believe that that really is a big difference. I think there's a lot of things we as educators can do if we get away from the notion that a standardized test measures the capability of a student and move toward what are the assets that student has.
So let me ask you about the other end of the spectrum, and that's the key, the ultimate standardized test, the SAT or the ACT. I mean, that causes pain to parents like you can't even imagine.
Absolutely.
But yet I have heard some institutions, and not just hippy-dippy institutions, that are now calling SAT, ACT scores optional.
Well, in some ways I would hope so, because statistically, a child from an impoverished family with the same SAT scores and same grades is going to be less likely to matriculate at a 4-year college than an upper middle class or professional son or daughter.
Why?
Again, it's because of family supports, those things that we look at as airbags, and maybe just preparation.
But how are schools, higher institutions, how do they differentiate without that one test that is the same across the nation? Because look, there's great inflation, there's great deflation, there's different
Absolutely.
rigor.
And they look at all those things, and I think that's very difficult, Brad. I think that's why they use one test. But if you look more at a student's portfolio, what did they do, what did they accomplish? And I'm not talking about these students with super resumes, because I've heard some of them that have done original published research when they're 13 years old. But did a child participate in community service? Did they really do something meaningful? What was their record in extracurricular activities? Were they involved in a team? Were they captain of a sports team?
But how then, at the same time, do you avoid a child that becomes so overscheduled just so they can pad their resume with extracurriculars that they burn out?
Well, that is a really, really good question. And if you look at, I think a lot of school districts that are on the opposite end of the socioeconomic spectrum,
meaning the
we
poor
are,
end.
the wealthier districts are dealing with high suicide rates.
Right.
I think the way you avoid it is you teach our society to look at balance in our children. And I'm talking about children up to 18, so that they have time to think, time to create.
You look at these elite schools, Stanford, 5% admission, Harvard, 5%, Yale, 4%, whatever it may be. I mean, even UCLA, 17%, USC around the same. Berkeley, 18%.
And it's tough. And Stanford works hard to make that 5% rate. They invite a lot of kids to apply. So what you do, first of all,
I see.
so
they want to lower their
they want that
admission,
rate, that 5%. It's a status symbol amongst educational institutions, higher ed.
Right.
So I think what you do is you work with children and families and say, what's your goal in life?
Right.
So if your goal in life is to be an engineer, a scientist, do you have to go to Stanford? No. You can go to Long Beach State. In fact, Timothy White, who was chancellor at UCR, now head of the Cal State system, went to Long Beach State.
No, it's true. There are so many outstanding colleges that don't have an H at the beginning of their name.
So it's kind of, I guess my thing is, you focus on a kid and their own assets and their own health.
His name is Elliott Duchon. He is the superintendent of Jurupa Unified School District, Pomerance. It's Charter Local Edition.